Hello everyone. Our topic this week was requested by Mason Danford and Chauncey Morris. We'll be going over Johnny Silverhand from Cyberpunk 2077, specifically his background prior to the beginning of the game. Still, spoilers for Cyberpunk 2077. Lida.
Okay, so Cyberpunk 2077 is based off the Cyberpunk pen and paper RPG, specifically the first two editions, Cyberpunk 2013 and Cyberpunk 2020. The current third edition is Cyberpunk Red for those who are interested. Like all tabletop RPGs, Cyberpunk presents a set of rules to allow players in a game master to run around in and tell their own stories. When you play a TTRPG, the story is about you, the player characters. However, Cyberpunk, like most systems, also provides a world framework, a campaign setting that you can use to frame the stories in, so that you don't have to build your own world from scratch. A prominent example from D&D would include the Forgotten Realms campaign setting, touched on briefly in our Ball video a few weeks ago. Similar to the Forgotten Realms and other campaign settings, the Cyberpunk setting comes with a world history, locations, backgrounds, and important to this video, notable characters that exist in the world. Johnny Silverhand is one such character. These important non-player characters, NPCs for the rest of this video, don't necessarily have to ever be encountered in the games at your table, but they have usually influenced the world in some important way, and some of them, like Johnny, get written into adventure modules to interact with the characters.
Prior to Cyberpunk 2077, Johnny specifically exists as an important NPC in two related modules, one from Cyberpunk 2013 called Never Fade Away, and one from Cyberpunk 2020 called Endgame. His story was retconned slightly for 2077's release, so we'll go over the way things went originally and then how the story was adjusted to lead into 2077. But Johnny led a life before the events of those modules, so we're going to take a step back, start with a bit of world setup, and tell the story from the beginning. The Cyberpunk games, in all of their iterations, are set in a dystopian punk rock future that diverges from real-world history most strongly in the mid to late 1980s, with a handful of minor changes before then as well. The short version is that world governments collapse and reform, sending humanity the world over into a downward spiral. A combination of disasters, social changes, advancing technology, and a lack of oversight led to a world where many corporations held power and influence comparable to sovereign nations. Johnny was born into the beginnings of this world in Texas on November 16, 1988. The same year, the original Cyberpunk rule set was released. Birth name Robert John Linder. One of Cyberpunk's numerous wars started when he was about 15 and lasted till Johnny was about 22, a period of 7 years. Somewhere during that time frame, Johnny joined the army and was shipped off to fight in that war.
Like all wars, it was ugly, but this one was particularly high in American casualties as a result of purposeful and/or foolish management by those in power. When the government's misdeeds were exposed to the troops, huge swaths of soldiers protested by laying down their arms, some of them literally, this is Cyberpunk, and leaving the fight. Despite the fact that the war would end with the government pulling out and leaving thousands of soldiers to make it home by their own devices, the government somehow managed to put a PR spin on the situation such that deserters like Johnny were looked upon very poorly. For his part, Johnny made his way to Northern California and settled in Night City, the setting for 2077 and both of the adventure modules in which he features. It was here, after the war, both to shake his deserter status and to try and put the horrors of war that took his friends and even his own arm from him, that he first took the name Johnny Silverhand, his moniker coming from the trademark replacement for his missing arm. Now a civilian, Johnny dedicated his life to fight against corporate and government corruption. Again, corporations had similar power to governments by this point and were just as culpable in the horrors of that war as the American government had been. Johnny's particular brand of rebellion came in the form of music. Alongside a fellow war veteran friend of his, Johnny started a rock band called Samurai. And while not all of their music was politically focused, they did perform several songs about the corruption of their times and the need to fight back against it. They started out in seedy bars and clubs, pulling nothing but small-time gigs, until eventually they were discovered, signed with a record label, and released a hit single that rocketed them to the top of the charts and kept them in the spotlight as they thundered on in a very techno-80s-fueled rendition of sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
The Cyberpunk TTRPG systems all have classes, or roles, that you have to select when making a character. 2077 does away with the classes and instead allows players to pick from an approximation of every role's ability list. Despite this, players of 2077 will still be familiar with role names such as Corporate or Corpo, Nomad, Fixer, etc. In our playthrough of the game, Isaac would most closely resemble a Netrunner or Techie, for example. Link to our 2077 playlist in the top corner and in the description for those interested. Johnny Silverhand is actually the prototypical example of another of these classes, the rocker boy. Rocker boys, hero or villain, are poets with a soul and a message they need to deliver. From street poets to politicians to actual rock stars, rocker boys influence the masses with the power of their words and sheer, raw charisma, with a little firepower to back them up when words are not enough. Rocker boys existed before Johnny, and rocker boys have continued after him, but Johnny Silverhand set in sterling silver the standard for what it truly meant to be a rocker boy. Samurai rocked the charts for a few years until the band's keyboardist threw her abusive spouse out of an 80-story window and spent a few months in jail. During her incarceration, the band split, though Johnny elected to start a solo career. As the head of the recently defunct Samurai band, Johnny was in such high demand that one company attempted to blackmail him into siding with them by threatening to tell the world he was an army deserter. In response, Johnny instead signed with the same label that had signed Samurai, and then released an album called Sins of Your Brothers, that not only admitted he was a war deserter, but exposed in glaring lyrical detail the sins of the governments and corporations that had orchestrated the war. Due to his sheer star power and the backing of his songs by those who lived the war, opinions of deserters were changed in the wake of the album's release. Johnny's solo musical career was almost exclusively politically focused, raking in money and fame through regular concerts to spread the word, as well as performing free benefit concerts for various causes. It should be noted, despite his methods, despite his purported ideals, and despite his results, Johnny was anything but a saint. He was a hard-rocking, ex-military man full of piss and vinegar, happy to shoot word or bullet wherever he needed to accomplish his goals, which was surprisingly effective.
This takes us to the events of the Never Fade Away module. Though he'd presumably had several flings and relationships before this, one of which we specifically know about, by the time of this module, Johnny was seriously dating a woman by the name of Alt Cunningham. Alt was one of, if not the very best netrunner hacker in all of Night City. Uncommonly, apparently, she was also a brilliant programmer, and was making similar waves in the tech and security industries with her skills as Johnny was in the music and political spectrums. Prior to the events of the module, while contracting for a corporation, Alt developed a program that would allow a netrunner to separate their net consciousness from their body, allowing them to explore the net untethered. The corporation she was working for modified the program into a trap that would isolate a netrunner's consciousness from their body, leaving their body to die in the real world while their consciousness was locked behind firewalls somewhere on the net, and dubbed it the Soul Killer program. Arasaka Corporation, one of the most powerful and influential corporations on the planet, got wind of Soul Killer's existence and tracked Alt down. So, one night, as Johnny and Alt were leaving one of his gigs, they got jumped by some hired thugs who kidnapped Alt and left Johnny for dead. Alt was then conscripted into recreating the program for Arasaka, and Johnny staged a violent rescue mission. TTRPGs being freeform by nature, in the module you can play the canon team that Johnny assembles, your own characters, or some combination thereof. But the basic storyline proceeds as follows.
By sundown that day, Johnny had gotten his old band back together to stage a completely free concert right in front of Arasaka headquarters, whipping the thousands of attendees into a frenzy that is ignited when nervous Arasaka guards fire into the hyped-up crowd. Using the planned mob's retaliation as a cover, Johnny and a group of his allies storm/sneak into the building to rescue Alt. For her part, Alt hadn't been idle. Knowing that since she'd been kidnapped to start writing this new Soul Killer program, they'd likely use her as a test dummy, or get rid of her some other way, Alt wrote a failsafe into the Soul Killer that would allow her to escape, and did so right under the nose of the Arasaka netrunners that were watching her every move. Her concerns proved valid, as once Arasaka's executives realized what was happening with Johnny's riot, they fed her to the Soul Killer, only to have her free herself through her back door and use Arasaka's internal security to kill off everyone in the room with her, except for the last executive, who managed to disconnect her body from the mainframe just as Johnny and company burst into the room. Mistaking Alt's disconnected and seemingly lifeless body for a truly lifeless one, Johnny killed the exec in a rage and took Alt's body to be cremated, while Alt looked on helplessly from security cameras as her body was carted off to die without her brain. It's worth noting that as this was a module, it can end numerous ways. There are even written-in scenarios for having the players save Alt, such as by plugging her back in so that she can live. But for the purposes of Cyberpunk 2077, canonically Never Fade Away ended this way.
Alt escaped onto the net, and sometime either before or after the next module would found a digital settlement for other rogue AI and disposed victims of the Soul Killer program, which saw weaponization after her death. However, before the events of the Endgame module, Arasaka recaptured her consciousness. A decade passed between Never Fade Away and Endgame. In that time, an event known as the Fourth Corporate War had begun, and mostly ended. Arasaka and another powerful corporation known as Militech had initially been hired out as muscle by two other corporations unable to solve their own dispute with simple money or corporate espionage. But the confrontation, fueled by years of rivalry, eventually bloomed into a full-blown war between Arasaka and Militech that rapidly eclipsed the initial conflict they'd both been hired for in the first place. The final days of the war took place in Night City. In the module, Militech puts together 3 teams of mercenaries, one headed by Johnny, one headed by another big NPC, and one consisting of the players. Johnny's group was to assault the upper floors of the Arasaka headquarters, extract Alt's consciousness, and escape with her and any information on Arasaka she might have. The other NPC's group was to provide heavy fire support for both teams, and the players' group was to infiltrate the lower levels while Johnny distracted security and deployed a small nuke in Arasaka's mainframe, wiping out vast amounts of important Arasaka data. Unbeknownst to all parties, Johnny's team was just a distraction. Their success was of little interest to Militech, and the nuke that the player party was given, which the players are told is a shaped charge that would only level Arasaka headquarters, was actually much more powerful.
To their credit, all teams partially succeed in their missions. Johnny and company rescue Alt's consciousness, putting her on a portable device for extraction before being stopped from escaping by a heavily armed cyborg mercenary named Atom Smasher, who features prominently in 2077. In the ensuing firefight, Johnny is literally blown in half by Atom Smasher's gunfire. Not wanting to leave her behind again when things look bad, Alt is released back onto the net by the other members of Johnny's team, who all then barely make it to extraction, where the other big NPC's team engages with Atom Smasher to allow their escape, while the player's team detonates the nuke, leveling most of the business center of Night City, which Militech tried and failed to spin as Arasaka, keeping contingency nukes in their base in the middle of the city. Johnny's body is never recovered. That's what happens in the module version. In the retconned version of history for 2077, the assault on Arasaka headquarters goes a bit differently. This is a reminder spoiler warning for the actual game. Rather than being 3 separate teams, Johnny leads a single assault team, though consisting of the same members, into the building. This time, they carry the nuke, fully planning to detonate it, both to destroy Arasaka's information and at least the building, if not the entire city center. Between the initial bomb and subsequent explosions, the entire district gets leveled regardless of intention, though. The plan to find the guy responsible for Alt's situation and rescue her consciousness is entirely a side notion of Johnny's alone, though it is his primary reason for going.
Once again, on the way out, the team is blocked by Atom Smasher. This time, the team escapes, and Johnny is gunned down by Atom Smasher. He is presumed dead, but survives the encounter, and Arasaka uploads his consciousness using the Soul Killer so that they can scan and interrogate his consciousness. About 50 years later, during the events of 2077, the head researcher on the Soul Killer project is being pressured for results in testing the downloading of stored consciousnesses into a new body. Arasaka was trying to move forward with commercializing quasi-immortality, but they'd yet to successfully implant a consciousness in a new body without eventual rejection and death. As the scientist was being pressured to move forward before he deemed the project ready, he loaded Johnny onto the data chip to be used in the trial, as he was expecting failure and Johnny's consciousness was disposable. In a twist, the estranged son of Arasaka's CEO stole the chip in an effort to make moves against the CEO, which ultimately culminates in the chip falling into the hands of V, 2077's protagonist, who seemingly becomes the first successful integration of a Soul Killer memory chip with a living host body. Afterward, V and Johnny war for control of their now shared body while forging a tense alliance as the events of the game move forward.
Wake the fuck up, samurai. We have a city to burn.
And that's the background story for Johnny Silverhand, rocker boy of the Cyberpunk franchise. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave us a like and share it with someone you know might like it. If you have ideas for videos you'd like to see in the future, do like Mason Danford and Chauncey Morris, and let us know in the comments down below. If you'd like to see more lore videos from us, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and if you'd like to see Let's Plays from us, like Cyberpunk 2077, go to the link in the description and subscribe to our Let's Play channel.
In the meantime, this has been
True Masters and Morons.
Signing off.